Okay, why don't we get started? Hi, everybody. It is so good to be here with all of you and the authors of The Hour, Kenji Yoshino and David Glasgow, whose new book just out yesterday that I do every time I can, a gratuitous promo, Say the Right Thing, How to Talk About Identity, Diversity, and Justice, just celebrated its release yesterday. My name is Jennifer Weiss-Wolf. I'm the executive director of the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network here at NYU Law. We proudly work in close partnership very often with the Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, of which Kenji is the faculty director, as well as the Justice Earl Warren Professor of Constitutional Law here at NYU Law, and David Glasgow is the executive director. And we're really lucky to actually have a shared team. Shirley Dang and Claire Whitman work with both of us, and we're really grateful that they've helped to organize today's discussion. I imagine you've all seen many of the accolades flying around about Say the Right Thing. Two favorites of mine on the book cover are the extraordinary Vanessa Williams, who calls it utterly informative, and a crucial read for anyone seeking the words to put their values into the world by Gretchen Rubin, perhaps the grandest purveyor of happiness. But we'll jump in just a moment. I want to point out that we'll have the Q&A box open for folks who want to post questions, and we'll be collecting those throughout the hour and leave about 15-20 minutes at the end to have audience Q&A. And also to just keep an eye on the chat, where our team will be posting all kinds of links for you to read afterwards, including the many op-eds and other media moments that Kenji and David have had, from the LA Times to the Boston Globe to Fast Company and Harvard Business Review. There's a lot of collateral reading in addition to the book, which we will post as well. So if you haven't purchased it yet, now is as good a time as any to do so. So there we go. Without further ado, let's take it to our authors. Starting with you, Kenji, just to sort of bring it all back home, I'd love to know the story of this book. What prompted the two of you to write this? And to write it now, is there something different that we need now that maybe even, compared to just a couple of years ago?
Yeah, so first of all, Jen, I want to say a big thank you to the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network, and to you and to Melissa and to all of our the team who's gathered here today, Shirley Dang, Claire Whitman, of course, my co-author, David Glasgow. So it's wonderful to be with you here. In terms of what led us to this book, we do think that there has been a change in the zeitgeist that, contrary to the regular doomsaying that my constitutional law students are used to, I will start in an optimistic note and say that in the diversity and inclusion realm, even in the past 5 years, I think we've seen a sea change in terms of the momentum that D&I has gotten. Of course, there are detractors that have gotten louder as well. But I think that the kind of root of that is allyship, that we're seeing it at unprecedented levels. Non-Black individuals going to Black Lives Matter protests, men going to the Women's March on Washington, cisgender and heterosexual individuals being good allies to the LGBTQ plus community. And so I think that that is really what's transformative about this moment, of everyone is realizing that allyship is necessary in order for us to get to the next level with regard to D&I. And we wrote this book because we thought that it's not really the kind of desire to be an ally that is lacking here, it's the tools, right? So that when we were pitching this book, I kept saying to editors, please don't anchor on anything that I or David has written previously, because we've written sort of concept pieces. This is like a screwdriver. This is a multi-tool that is an attempt to offer like a shame-free, rigorous, practical guide to close the gap between that desire to be an ally and effective allyship.
Thank you. And I really appreciate that. I read the book over this past week, and the ability to sort of wrestle with these questions without worrying about being sort of ashamed or too conscious of that impulse was something that really kind of shined through to me. David, I want to direct the next question to you. You write in the book that nobody can afford to sit out these conversations anymore. What do you mean by that exactly? And I mean, I'm just sort of thinking about who is even on this at this talk with us. We have everybody from students to faculty to managers to professional folks to people who exist, as community members with their families. what it is, what's incumbent upon all of us to do. What does that look like in this moment? And how is it that your method works for all of us or can be applied to all of us?
So a big reason why we think no one can afford to sit these conversations out anymore is just that they're ubiquitous. So if you go into a professional workplace these days, you're likely to encounter conversations about unconscious bias or privilege or task forces or events on racial equity, gender equity, participation in pride marches, etc. That's happening more and more inside large organizations. In schools and universities, even as young as preschools now, there's education on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion and opportunities for conversations there. It's really impossible to even read the news these days without seeing headlines that relate to issues of gender, race, LGBTQ, socioeconomic status, disability, and there's just a lot more activism around these issues. And a lot of that has come from social movements that we've seen gather steam over the past decade, whether it is the Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter, Stop Asian Hate, LGBTQ rights, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's becoming just increasingly inescapable. No matter where you turn, you're going to encounter an identity-related conversation before too long. And in terms of, how this can apply to everybody, regardless of where they're coming into the conversation, Kenji and I did write the book specifically for allies. So for people who are coming into these conversations, often from more kind of advantaged or dominant group sides. So if you're a white person entering a conversation about issues of race, or if you're a man entering a conversation about gender, for instance. And we point out in the book that everyone has baskets of advantage and disadvantage in their life, which means that everyone shows up as an ally sometimes in these conversations and can participate in them. So in that respect, Jen, we do think that even though the book has a somewhat seemingly narrow focus on what allies can do, we think that term ally applies really broadly.
Thanks, David. All right, I want to actually ask both of you the same question here. We'll do a bit of toggling back and forth this afternoon, but this one is for both of you. You write in the book, you give some examples of tough situations you found yourselves in. And when I read those, it mostly made me feel better to think that I just wasn't alone. I was like, oh, well, if it happened to Kenji and David, I guess that's, only natural that would happen to me too. So I really appreciated that vulnerability, but also that, creating that kind of like room for error that we're all need to sort of have grace with ourselves about. So I'm going to invite you now to share some stories, whether it's ones that you wrote about in the book or anything you've thought about since then, with our community here at the book talk. Could you give us an example of a time that it didn't go quite right? And then maybe in addition to just sort of bearing your soul that way, also sort of walk us through what the steps are that you describe in the book, the ways that you're able to sort of consider the situation, to think about your reaction, to think about what how you might pivot the next time. I think sort of a real live lesson would be very valuable for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can speak to one that's really close to home, right? Which is that a few years ago, I was reading a piece about how law professors still call on men more than they call on women in their Socratic, questioning. And so I was, curious to know whether I was doing this as someone who aspires to be a male ally to women in his life. And so I had my then wonderful administrative assistant, Corey Conley, sit at the back of the room and audit me as I taught the class. And to my chagrin and mortification, I realized that, I was indeed calling more on men than I was calling on women. And so this is, unacceptable, right? And so I resolved to do better. And for about 3 or 4 classes, I was able to do that. But then I realized that once my attention sort of flagged or went elsewhere and I became sort of tired or stressed or even excited about the material, I would be back to my old bad practices. And so this is kind of a conversation I was having with the, scholar who had pointed out this dynamic more than some individual calling me out. But it was a matter of kind of profound embarrassment for me that A, I was doing it in the first place, and B, I couldn't get better even when I tried. And, one of the things that we talk about in the book is the importance of, offering yourself some modicum of kind of kind of affirmation and having the kind of resilience, but also the curiosity to look for solutions when ones are not immediately available. So here I realized that what I needed was more of a systemic solution, because one of the things that we know about fighting unconscious bias is that it's like stretching a rubber band. When the rubber band is stretched, we can engage in unbiased behavior. But once we let go of it, the rubber band snaps back into place and we're back to our old, unconsciously biased ways. So here, the systemic solution, I have to, credit Iris Bonet, the author of the wonderful book, What Works? Gender Equality by Design, for this, was to just shove in a system at that moment of higher consciousness when the rubber band was stretched to make sure that I would be able to live up to my own ideal. So the solution, and those of you who've taken large classes with me know this, was to ask my administrative assistant to randomize the class list and hand me a newly randomized list before I walked into every class. And no matter how tired or stressed or excited about the material I was, I could call down that list. But I share that story not only to say, we all make mistakes, and that certainly includes sort of myself, right? So I will never, unfortunately, ever, stop making these mistakes. And so the point is not to be perfect, but rather to be better, right, than you were before. And then hopefully, right, to find the solution, which, as far as I know from my subsequent audits, has led to a good sort of unbiased solution in terms of more egalitarian, on-call procedures to actually fix it, right? So sometimes I think, Jen, the shame that we feel impedes us from actually addressing and fixing the problem, which helps exactly nobody.
I just want to interject before you start, David, which I love what you just said about the goal is not to be perfect, but to be better. That's so much more manageable to live with in your head. And it allows you, again, the grace of forgiveness, but also the drive to go forward, to keep, to know that each time you might be able to get it a little better. I really love that phrase.
Yeah, and just to share a story that we talk about in the book on my part. So we give an example of a meeting that I had a couple of years ago with a group of senior professionals of color, and I was the only white person in that meeting. And they were talking to me in my capacity as executive director of this center to get my advice about how to approach an upcoming meeting that they were having with, other senior professionals in their industry. And I said something very glib, like, oh, well, those other producers that you're meeting with are happy to meet with you because you're nice. And they immediately in the room sort of cringed, and someone spoke up and said, David, I love you, but that what you just said, didn't land on me well, because, we're respected in our industry, not because we're nice, it's because we're actually accomplished and we've achieved a lot in our field, and we're good advocates for ourselves. And I immediately felt this kind of horrible guilt, also a bit of self-pity, if I'm honest, because I kind of thought, oh, you're misinterpreting me. I wasn't saying that you don't have accomplishments, et cetera, et cetera. But I also felt this tremendous guilt because I immediately realized that how it came across was that here I am as this, only white person in the meeting, essentially congratulating these highly accomplished people for being nice instead of for what they've actually achieved in their professional roles. And so I kind of kept playing that meeting over and over in my head for, the rest of the day, and felt kind of sick in the stomach, like I had sort of come across as racist or something. And I think this kind of illustrates the catastrophizing that can go on in these conversations sometimes, where I think when you're coming in as an ally, you feel so uncomfortable that you can spiral a little bit out of control. And so one of the techniques that I used to deal with that was to engage in self-affirmation. So it can sound a little bit hokey sometimes, but there's social science research to suggest that if you think about things in your life that give your life meaning and purpose, or that you feel proud of, the accomplishments that you have, or values that you have, or people that are important to you in your life, that process of self-affirmation can actually ground you emotionally in these conversations, even if the things you're affirming have nothing to do with the conversation that you're having. And so I paused for a moment and I started to think about, what do I care about? I care about my family, my husband, my children. What do I also care about this work that we do in our center on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I thought about the values that brought me to that work in the first place, some of the things that Kenji and I had achieved together in our center, and just going through that process helped me put in perspective the fact that I had made this mistake in this conversation and feel a little bit less, horrifically guilty about what I had done, because I was able to sort of keep it in proportion. And the other thing that I did was that I just talked about it with my husband that evening. We write in the book about how it's very important as an ally, if you're feeling this emotional turmoil, not to burden the affected people that you're speaking with that turmoil. So it would have been inappropriate for me to say in that room to those professionals, oh, I'm feeling really guilty right now. Can you please reassure me, et cetera, because that's just making the kind of recipients of my original offense turning the tables and making them comfort and reassure me. But we do think that it's valuable for allies to seek support from other people in their life who are not directly affected. And so I went home from work that evening and spoke with my husband about the incidents and got comfort and reassurance from him instead. So I think those tools, among many that we talk about in our chapter on resilience, can help people deal with the emotional turmoil in these conversations.
Thanks. I'm glad you shared those. I imagine people who are listening in right now maybe feel the same sort of relief, or just kind of it's a little bit freeing to be able to, I don't know, examine, to have that kind of self-affirmation just as we're hearing this, and not in the middle of a moment or something, that's making us particularly individually uncomfortable, but to think about more broadly. I think, Kenji, you just used the word curiosity before, and I pulled that out of the book as well. This comes directly from the book. Nearly every ally could benefit from being a little less self-assured and a little more curious. Curious is such a great word in the first place. Like it gives us a wide array of paths, not just the opposite of self-assured, but something that embodies maybe even more open-mindedness and creativity. So I'd love for one of you to talk a little bit more about curiosity, and exactly what you mean by curiosity, and then what kind of skills it takes to cultivate the quality of curiosity.
Yeah, so we think that curiosity is a super important cardinal value in these conversations, mainly because when you're entering these conversations as an ally, there's a lot of information that you don't know and a lot of knowledge that you don't know. So we give the example of, let's suppose, which is true of me, that I'm not a wheelchair user. I don't have a motor function disability that requires a wheelchair. Well, if I'm in a conversation with someone who does use a wheelchair, there is so much knowledge that person has gained just from living their life in the world about what it is like to have a disability and the barriers that people with disabilities face that I don't know going into that conversation. So I might not have any clue in my own neighborhood where the curb cuts or ramps are. I might not know what biases disabled people experience in their life, how to overcome those biases. I also might not know all the kind of assumptions and stereotypes that non-disabled people like me bring to these conversations, whereas my conversation partner likely does have that knowledge. And so it's very important for me to realize the limitations of my knowledge and also take steps to educate myself on those issues if I want to show up productively as an ally on disability issues. And then even more deeply than that, we talk about how there are some forms of ignorance where you don't even know that you don't know something, right? So in the case of disability, I at least have that awareness of there's all this information out there that I don't know. But sometimes there's also unknown unknowns, areas where we're not even aware of our own lack of knowledge. And so let's say about transgender issues. I know, for example, that there is a difference between the terms transgender, non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid, but I might not know exactly what the difference between those terms are. And so I can just look it up. I can literally just Google that and get the answer to that question. But let's say there's an area in this field that I don't even know I don't know about. So let's say I think that you need to have undergone gender confirmation surgery or be taking hormones to be transgender. Well, that's just an area where I don't even know about my own ignorance, that that's not what you need to be a transgender. And so in those situations, we just really encourage people to adopt a posture of radical humility. And so we draw on the work of philosopher Christy Dodson in encouraging people to enter these conversations a little bit like you're entering a nuclear physics seminar, right? So even if I've done all the readings about nuclear physics, I'm still going to be worried that I don't really get it in the seminar. I'm going to be asking a lot of questions. I'm going to be sharing my own perspective in the conversation tentatively because I'm not sure if I really get it or if I need to listen more intently to understand. And so we want people to take a little bit of that same posture of humility that you would apply in a nuclear physics seminar and apply it to conversations about identity.
I mean, I'm just thinking, could you give an example of just even how that would play out sort of in the difference between not wanting to burden the other person in the conversation versus wanting to demonstrate generosity or curiosity or an openness to learning? That could be really helpful, I think.
Sure. Kenji, do you want to take this one or do you want me to continue?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. You know, I think that I mean, you're putting your finger on something that's really important, right? Because I think that one of the kind of core teachings of allyship is that you're not supposed to burden the affected person in the name of helping them. So, and those burdens can be, you know, cognitive or emotional, right? So we all know the ally who says, oh, you know, I'm reacting to the murder of George Floyd. Please give me a syllabus, right, about everything that I need to read in order to be a better ally to the Black community. And meanwhile, the affected person is like, I'm in trauma right now. The last thing I need to do in this particular situation is be your educator, right? So I think that is a really well, you know, placed concern. I would also add that the burdens can be emotional as well. You know, if I burst into tears when I'm having the conversation with the affected person, then I can often divert all of the energy away from them and towards myself, again, even if I have the best intentions. So I think what you're setting up is really beautifully, Jen, is like this tension in between you're not allowed to go to the affected person for information, but also, right, you're meant to be curious about their experience, right? And oftentimes you may feel like that person is the best person to go to. So the way we thread that needle, and we talk about this directly in the book, is to say, you know, and this will be familiar, you know, as a kind of legal locution, is to like try to exhaust your remedies, right? If you can get the information from anyone other than that individual, then try to get that information from those other sources. So that can take the form of saying, okay, I don't know enough about the neurodiverse community, or I don't know enough about, you know, the trans community. And so therefore I'm going to go out and do my own research on this, right? Or I'm going to go to somebody who can teach me about this, who's being, you know, remunerated either psychically or financially for doing that, like who does this professionally for a living, right? And luckily those resources are ever more abundant, right, with every passing year. So the only time you should really be going to the affected person is where you feel like they have information that only they have. Like, for example, if you're going to them with curiosity about how they wish to be helped in that particular situation, you're not going to get that from a podcast or an article. You're going to need to go to the affected person themselves to get that information, right? Lest that seem very sort of hard edged, there are times, right, when you're kind of on the bubble and you say either because of time or other constraints, you kind of want to ask the affected person for the information. But in those circumstances, we think that, again, humility can do you a lot of good. And so we talk a lot about sort of asking to ask, like, would you mind if, right, I asked you a question, or are you in a good state of mind for this particular, you know, conversation? And then they can always, you know, say no to that and then redirect you right back to your other resources. But I think our takeaway is in threading the needle in between the very kind of cogent sort of distinction that you've drawn between please don't further burden the affected person by asking them for information, but also sometimes there is information that only the affected person holds, is to really say exhaust your remedies where you can. Where you have exhausted those remedies, then approach the affected person with a degree of humility about the burden you're placing on them in order to get the information you need.
Thanks, Kenji. That's a exhaust your remedies is on my list of great legal phrases in my pocket. You used an analogy before too about the stretching of the rubber band and the discomfort of that elasticity. And that made me think of what you both write in the book about that awful moment perhaps that people experience when they have said the wrong thing and they're struggling with what they said being attributed to who they are, their own identity, and that fear of being branded by, you know, whatever ism they stepped into, and that it means that they're now branded as a not good person. And the way you all describe it in the book is what it means to be a goodish person, and goodish is in quotes because it's probably not really a word. So I would love to have a little bit of conversation about that, about being goodish people, what we do to set ourselves up for the mistakes that are or missteps that are inevitably going to happen, and that we can kind of release ourselves from the fear of those, such that we don't even open ourselves up at all in out of fear of making mistakes. What does it mean to be a goodish person? Identify oneself as a goodish person, and not carry that worry that the place and time we get it wrong suddenly becomes who we are.
Yeah, I thank you for that. Again, such a wonderful question. And, you know, I sort of go immediately to our wonderful friend and colleague, Dolly Chugh, who is over at the Stern School here at NYU. And she's written a couple of brilliant books, but she actually coined, as far as I know, this let's move from beyond the good-bad dichotomy to thinking of ourselves as good-ish people, right? But, you know, she sort of gives this, and I should say, she gives this in the context that is sort of rich and I think worth rehearsing here. So what she says is kind of growth mindset has conquered the educational world, right? So this is the psychologist Carol Dweck's distinction between the growth mindset, where I think my capabilities are susceptible to expansion, versus a fixed mindset where I think I either have it or I don't, and I'm not going to be able to, you know, grow, right, in this domain. And she says in domains as kind of wildly diverse as like athletics to business to, you know, academia, the growth mindset always will beat out the fixed mindset by a long mile. So even my, you know, kids, you can see in the background, are not allowed to say at their school, I'm not good at math, right? They're told to say, I'm not good at math, comma, yet, right? With the impetus to kick them into the growth mindset of like, I'm not good at this currently, but that doesn't mean that this is a permanent state, right? So this is perhaps a long setup, right? But I think an important one, because then Chugh pivots and says, isn't it funny how when we go into diversity and inclusion conversations, all that growth mindset, you know, that we have cultivated over the years just completely goes out the window, right? So we say, you know, oh, you know, I'm actually so flooded with identity threat that I'm going to be sort of mired in the fixed mindset. And she tries to explain this by saying that the cost of mistakes, as you just alluded to, Jen, is so much greater in the identity conversation than it is in other domains of learning. So if you make a mistake in my constitutional law class, and I see some of my con law students here in the Q&A, sort of big deal, right? You know, just go read another case on the Dormant Commerce Clause and you'll be good, right? So, you know, I don't view it as a big deal. The student doesn't view it as a big deal, you know, so what, right? But if I say, you know, I misgender, right, a colleague or a student, right, in the classroom, then the threat level just goes much, much higher, right? Because suddenly I'm worried not that I've just made a mistake, right? I've engaged in certain problematic conduct, right? But that I have been revealed to be a certain kind of person, right? That I'm a transphobe, or if you multiply examples, that I'm, you know, a racist or a sexist or a bigot of some stripe. So Chugh says that that kind of identity threat, the threat to ourselves as a good moral person, is so overwhelming that, again, as you say, it pushes us into our corners and we go into this defensive crouch and we say, I'm going to not even step into the space of allyship. I'm not even going to try in these conversations anymore because I'm so scared of either hurting somebody I really care about or being canceled myself, you know, as a terrible person. So how do we actually overcome this? This is why I talked about growth mindset, you know, at the outset, right? Because she offers, right, kind of new old strategy, right? It's new in this context, but part of the force of the recommendation is that this is something that's canon in every other part of learning, which is to say, in the D&I context, try to make it consistent with other learning enterprises and to say, I'm going to adopt a growth mindset here. So it would be ridiculous, for example, if I said, I'm going to teach you constitutional law, and we're going to have a great semester together, but my one requirement is that you make no mistakes, right? We wouldn't learn that much together. right, if that were the requirement. So similarly, in D&I conversations, what Chook says is, understand that mistakes are just kind of par for the course, and we're not going to get better unless we make those mistakes, right? And so she urges us to adopt sort of some strategies that are very familiar to anyone who's in the growth mindset world, and then some strategies that are specific to D&I. So one strategy that is familiar in the growth mindset context is the comma yet strategy, right? So just as my kids are told to say, I'm not good at math, comma yet, when I misgender my student and I say, oh, you know, obviously I should apologize. Obviously I shouldn't feel great about that, right? But I can say, instead of the self-talk that says, oh, Kenji, you're not good at pronouns, say, I'm not good at pronouns, comma yet. Because ultimately no one is helped, right, by my sort of going into a shame spiral and not trying to improve my behaviors, right? It's much more productive, both for me and for the person to whom I'm seeking to be an ally, the person I've misgendered and other individuals who might be misgendered by me in the future, for me to adopt a growth mindset and try to grow past my mistake. You know, a similar example from the growth mindset context, before I go to the specific D&I thought, is to make sure that you compare yourself to yourself, right, rather than yourself to other people. We can always, you know, find people who are better at, you know, whatever we're struggling with than we are, and we can use that in order to beat ourselves up and to keep ourselves from growing. So growth mindset 101 is to, rather than for me to compare myself to you and say, Jen is so much better at pronouns than I am, the better play is to say, am I better at talking about pronouns than I was a year ago, right? And so that kind of longitudinal, right, interpersonal or intrapersonal comparison is much more useful, right, rather than a slice of time interpersonal comparison. And then finally, to kind of loop back to where you began, right, the goodish person notion, it's also Chook's insight that we divide the world into good and bad people, and that we tend to want to think of ourselves quite naturally as good people. And I certainly would like to, you know, think of myself as that, right? But she says, you know, against intuition, this is not a good strategy, right? Because in the D&I context, if you don't make a mistake, then you're complacent. If you do make a mistake and you've divided the world into like sheep and goats, then you risk being kind of thrust into the bad person category, even if only in your own mind. And it's really important that instead of thinking of yourself as a good or bad person, you think of yourself as a good-ish person, because that's what will stimulate the growth mindset, specifically in the D&I context. That we all construe ourselves as people who are on this journey together. We're all going to make mistakes. And believe me, it's not a question of whether, it's a question of when we will make a mistake in this domain, right? If we think of ourselves as goodish people, we're much more likely to recover from that. The last thing I'll say here before I kind of land the plane on this is to say that, you know, I think oftentimes, and totally fairly, and David and I agonized over this, people say, well, you're letting yourself off the hook too easily if you engage in that kind of goodish mindset of saying, like, do you actually get to make mistakes over and over again and keep telling yourself, oh, I'm a goodish person, so I can move on. And what, you know, we struggle with this. It does hit home, right? So it's not like we are saying this with utter confidence, but the social science does seem to support the idea that accountability and compassion for yourself are not at loggerheads with each other. You know, to the contrary, it's when we have compassion for ourselves that we are able to see and acknowledge our mistakes, and that's a predicate for greater growth, and therefore the predicate for greater accountability.
Thank you. Thank you. That's really helpful. And it makes me think about where, you know, the phrase cancel culture then fits into all of that. If we all are, you know, goodish and on this journey, and yet we live in, you know, in a society where that's a thing. We all know what the phrase means. I don't need to put quotes around it. So you argue in the book that we need to hit the pause button on cancel culture. So I'd love to hear more about your thoughts about this, and also like whether you think that's a controversial take at this point. If cancel culture has served a purpose, and you know, and create a different power structure. So I'd love to talk a little bit about cancel culture.
It's a great question, and you know, it may be a controversial take, although I hope not as controversial as it might sound, because I want to be clear on what we mean by, you know, hitting the pause button on cancel culture. So we certainly don't mean, you know, let's stop calling out people in power who are engaging in egregious behavior, right? I think cancel culture at its best targets, you know, political leaders, other leaders. It advocates for systemic change. There's forms of activism that are very confrontational that I think are hugely valuable and often the only way that you can get to lasting systemic change for long-standing injustices, right? So we talk in the book about how sometimes if you're engaged in political activism, you might deliberately stoke conflict and, call out people in power in confrontational ways, have a walkout or a demonstration, make people really uncomfortable. And that's great because that can actually lead to change in a way that perhaps just having a civil conversation with someone might not be as effective. Where we think that there needs to be an alternative to cancel culture is more in these everyday person-to-person conversations that we've been describing in ordinary situations with our colleagues, with our friends, with our family members. So an example that we give in the book from a student of ours told us a story about a Thanksgiving dinner where she and her partner, who is trans, were at this dinner, and her grandfather, the student's grandfather, misgendered the partner of our student. And then our student's brother immediately kind of publicly shamed the grandfather and sort of jumped up and down and called him transphobic and said he's always like this and he's never supportive. And the grandfather kind of felt humiliated by that exchange. Also, importantly, the partner who was misgendered felt mortified by the fact that this had been turned into a federal case rather than being something that was could have just been addressed more politely in civil conversation. So in situations like that, we think it's more helpful to actually show generosity to the person who made the mistake and give them some tools to help them grow past and learn from their mistake. And so we advocate for what we call coaching culture instead of cancel culture. And I think that term coaching culture is really important for a couple of reasons. One is that a coach still holds people to high standards, right? It wouldn't be a very good coach if they just said, oh, no big deal, you made a mistake, I'm just going to let you off the hook. The whole purpose of the coach is that they're training people on how to improve. The difference is that with cancel culture is that it really is about training them on how to improve. It's giving them tangible skills. It's saying, here's how to apologize. Here's how you can disagree respectfully. Here's how you can build curiosity. That's the kind of work that a coach does, as opposed to immediately condemning someone for making a mistake.
That's super helpful. The coaching analogy is really powerful. Thank you for that. All right, I have a practical 101 question for you both. Among the many op-eds you've had published in the past couple of weeks around the launch of the book is one called How to Apologize in the Boston Globe. I think we could all use a little bit of 101 in how to apologize, and particularly how to apologize in a way that demonstrates all of the values that you've been advocating in the book and throughout the hour. So those who are on the receiving end of our apologies know what we mean and that we mean it.
Yeah, so great. So I hasten to say that, that chapter on apology is paired with the chapter on disagreement. So we want people to have the space to disagree. So we certainly don't want people to apologize when they don't mean it. We would much prefer a respectful disagreement over an inauthentic apology. So from the get-go, right, the setup here is, you've done something wrong and you authentically want to apologize to the other person. If you don't want to do that, then we recommend the chapter on disagreement, just to help people navigate their way through the book and to situate this particular chapter in the book. But if you do want to apologize, this is actually one of my favorite chapters, in the book, and one of my favorite things that I've written of all time, because it's one of these things where initially it just seems so amorphous, it just seems like human interactions are so subtle and nuanced that it would seem like a kind of fool's errand to say that you could come up with the elements of an apology. But we had this sort of crackerjack team of research assistants, and again, I see some in the chat here. And so we sent them out, to sort of look at the best that have been written on apologies, whether that was in the social science or in pop psychology and the humanities, what have you. And what we came to realize is that good apologies, and we're happy to be proven wrong here, but we really do think that there are 4 elements to a successful apology. And we call them the 4 R's because, of our own penchant for alliteration. And these are recognition, responsibility, remorse, and redress, right? And so if you think about these failed celebrity apologies that we read about in the news, they often flunk one of these 4, elements. So to take them up in turn, the first one is recognition, sort of acknowledging exactly what you've done wrong. So, formulations like, if I did it, I'm sorry, or whatever I did, I'm sorry, are disfavored because you're not actually even copying to what you did wrong. And so there's some uncertainty about what you're apologizing for. So, when George Santos says, as he recently did, if I offended somebody, right, I'm sorry, right? So we want someone in that situation to sort of acknowledge what they've done and not to sort of try to squirm their way out of it by using some conditional phrase. Now, the second element is responsibility. And so if the word if is the kind of tell for not taking a posture of recognition, then the word but is the word that sort of often tips us off to the fact that someone's not taking responsibility. So saying something like, I'm sorry, comma, but, as Roseanne Barr said, it was 2 a.m. and I was Ambien tweeting, right? Sort of undermines the apology because you might think like, well, are you never going to take Ambien again? Are you never going to tweet at 2 a.m. in the morning again? Am I to expect a repeat of the same behavior, right? The next time, you're in that condition, right? So it's much more effective just to say, I'm sorry, period. There's no excuse, period, right? Rather than adding a kind of but that undermines any kind of responsibility that you're taking for the action. Then the third one is remorse. And this is often less, in my experience, sort of signified by particular words than it is by context. So our go-to apology here is Mario Batali's, apology after he was accused of sexual assault. And it's not even a great apology to begin with, but it's like at least like passable, right? But then at the end, he like torpedoes all of his good work by adding a PS that says, for those of you who are interested in like, recipes for the holiday season, like here's one for like cinnamon rolls. And you're just like, you've got to be kidding me, right? You can't, like, you just destroyed any credibility that you just had. I don't believe that you are at all remorseful. Like if you can't sort of see that, adding the cinnamon roll recipe at the end of your apology doesn't undermine it altogether. And the last one is redress, which is to say that apologies are often seen as a form of closure, but we want people to see them as not just closing the book on something, but opening another book, right? You're promising that you'll engage in a future course of conduct that is different from the one that you're apologizing for. So it's a kind of implicit promise. So it may seem a little bit overwhelming, but we actually think that that's the core of it. And we think that people often try to hedge their apologies and failing one of these elements because they think that they are going to protect themselves in that way. And we get, because we've been there ourselves, how vulnerable you can feel when you're apologizing to someone. You might feel like, oh, they're going to pile on, particularly if it's an identity issue, you again, might get punished disproportionately. And so you try to protect yourself by hedging. But what we have found in both the research and our own experience is that you sort of serve neither end of offering a real apology, nor of really protecting yourself if you fail one of these elements, because the apology isn't received as authentic. And then you haven't protected yourself because the person just sort of rejects the apology and actually wants you to apologize for the apology that you failed to give. So hopefully those are some good rules of the road, those 4 R's. But it was a joy to write because it took something that, it's a kind of microcosm of the book as a whole. It took something that looked kind of scary and amorphous, and it really kind of boiled it down to certain elements, which, while not a panacea, are at least kind of guardrails, right, around the conversations that we try to have in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. That was really that's really helpful and enlightening. Okay, I'm going to give one more question before we turn it over. I know we've got some questions coming through in the Q&A already, so we'll be turning it over to those. Please, folks, feel free to write in your questions, and we're calling those, and we'll make sure they get asked. But I'm gonna give one last question, which is just to acknowledge that sort of in our culture right now, we're in a time of such deep polarization. And it's just worn people down for so many reasons. And among the things we're tired from are the fear of continuing to try to find common ground. So what gives you faith? You've written a whole book about the art of conversation. What is your North Star here? What gives you faith about and hope about moving forward?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that I'm quite cynical and pessimistic about. And I do think that when I look at the sort of political arena, if I look at Congress, if I look at the Supreme Court, even if I look at social media, I don't have a lot of faith in conversation. I think sometimes those kind of activist approaches to kind of just, winning elections and winning court cases or whatever it is kind of the way that we need to focus on driving change. I do, however, think that in local communities, in our day-to-day lives, a lot of the polarization that we see on cable news or in Congress or on social media is not as strong in those daily conversations. I do think that if we turn to think about the neighbors in our community or other parents at our children's schools or colleagues of ours at work, I think most of us can conjure examples of situations where we have been able to learn from each other and find common ground and find areas where we can grow together. And I continue to have faith in those local everyday conversations that we're having with people in our communities or in our families. And part of the reason why I have faith in that is because it's one of the tools that every single one of us has, right? We're not all going to become politicians. We're not all going to become justices or even activists in a kind of full-time capacity. Whereas I think one thing that every single one of us can do is turn to people in our lives. It might be a family member who is recalcitrant on particular issues of inclusion, or it might be a colleague at work or a task force that you can kind of advocate for with your manager. The fact that we all have that power to use conversations in our local spheres of influence to make change gives me tremendous hope, because I think it's something, and that's one of the reasons why we, wrote this book, to give people the tools to be able to do that.
Thank you so much, both of you. This has been such a delightful conversation in its openness and in its positivity. So thank you. We've got a lot of questions queued up, so I'm going to start powering through them. And I will I'm going to read them out loud. Some have a name, some don't have a name, but I'm just going to get us right through them. So the first question is actually a question about both of your experience in writing this book, and it is from somebody who knows you well. They want to know if there's anything, an issue, a topic, a tactic, any aspect of the book that you ended up taking a complete 180 on, that you came in expecting one thing and found yourself landing elsewhere.
Yeah, I don't think that there is anything, cosmic, but take a couple of examples. 180 might be too strong, but there are things where when we were working through them, we realized that we disagreed with, conventional wisdom in various ways, where we had kind of participated in that conventional wisdom earlier. So, one example would be, it's canon in D&I circles to say distinguish between intent and impact. Your intent is never relevant. It's only the impact on the other person that's relevant. And then, I kept thinking about the Holmes quote that says even a dog knows the difference between, being stumbled over and being kicked. And I thought, well, what if the intent actually makes a difference on the impact on the other person? Like, surely, even if we're focusing only on impact, my intent might be relevant in softening the impact or not, Similarly, when we were thinking about sort of being an ally to the source of non-inclusive behavior, right? I think both of us had kind of a sympathy, right? Or more of a sympathy than we do now for the cancel culture. And again, we want to underscore that we still think, cancel culture is just consequence culture when the behavior is egregious or if the person's no desire to learn or get better, right? But I think both of us kind of worked through a place to say for the remainder of individuals, people who haven't done something egregious, people who want to get better, something like the coaching culture would be a better approach.
Anything you want to weigh in, David?
Well, yeah, I'm happy to, but I also want to make sure we get some of the other questions. So whatever you prefer, Jen.
I'm curious to know from you, but we'll ask you after if we get through everything. How about that?
Sounds great. Sounds good.
So then a question that comes actually, I'm presuming from a student, to want to know how to engage in the university community, in the law school community, when the other party is a professor. how to engage when perhaps there's a feeling of a power imbalance?
It's a great question. We wrote this book for, as I said, kind of at the outset, for more people who are in the higher power position rather than the lower power position. So we didn't want to be sort of writing to people from, say, a marginalized community or someone who is in that low power position for how to advocate in these situations, both because, other people have written books on that, but also because, we just felt like we wanted to equip the professor in that case with the tools for how they could handle these conversations differently. Nonetheless, I do think some of the tools that we offer in the book can be useful for these kinds of conversations. And so separating the behavior from the person is a good strategy, I think, for confronting a professor. So if a professor has said something that didn't land well on you, I think it's important to focus more on what the professor said and the impact that the professor's words had, rather than to ascribe ill intent, right? To sort of say something to that professor that makes it sound like you think they did it maliciously, because it's just human nature that when someone makes an accusation of intent against us, we tend to get very defensive. And it's also kind of strategically unwise because, if the professor says, well, actually, no, I didn't mean it like that. It's very hard to think of an appropriate response because, what are you going to say to them? Well, no, I actually know what was in your head better than you know what was in your head. Whereas I think if you focus on the behavior and say, when you said, this word or used this term or taught this case in this way, here's where it landed on me, or here's why it landed on me in this unhelpful way. I think you're going to create there, hopefully, more of a receptive outcome in terms of the professor is more likely to listen to you and take your feedback on board if they perceive that you're coming at them as a peer with a suggestion rather than as kind of someone who is looking down on them as a bad person for all the reasons that we've talked about in this session already.
Thanks for that. The next question actually goes back to something you had said prior, David, about not everybody necessarily being, an activist or doing this in sort of a professional environment, but even at home and in the communities in which they reside. So the question is that often people will hear an unjust or a biased remark and they don't know what to say in the moment. That heat of the moment really can be just, what do you do? It's you feel anger, you feel fear, you feel pressure. And so they want to know if there are some good rules of thumb about, the real-time experience, especially if it's somebody that you live with or engage with on a regular basis in, work or other environments. The real practical advice here.
Yeah, so I'd love to jump in
advice.
on that one because I love this question, and we've tried to sort of answer it sort of foursquare in the book. So in general, we feel like we shouldn't offer scripts because, again, these are nuanced human interactions. And so oftentimes people say, just tell me what to say and I'll say it. And it's like, that's actually not what we're driving at. That's not our project, right? But in this very narrow circumstance that this question is identifying, we are willing to, bend that rule because we think that there's a distinctive aspect to this where it's often very time pressured, like you're in a classroom, you're in a meeting, right? And somebody says something wildly problematic and you as an ally need to step in and interrupt that. And you don't have the chance to go around and do hub and spoke communication simply because there are 100 people in the room and you're just never going to be able to do that. And you need to let people know you've taken care of it. But at the same time, it's so potentially confrontational and combustible that you're scared about finding the right form of words. And so often you kind of freeze. And you have the pensée de l'escalier, right? The staircase thought, right? Where you have the exact right comeback or intervention in the staircase outside of the room rather than the room where it would have mattered. So the Fast Company link, goes through this more deeply, but we also in the chat, but we also talk about it in the book to say, here's a kind of menu of options. And we want people to now sort of rely on the kind of idea that there's a diversity of temperament among all the other kinds of diversities there are. So when I think about my own temperament and that menu, I think like saying something kind of short and sharp, like ouch or yikes, it's just not who I am. So I can't imagine ever doing that, even though I've seen other people do that effectively. It won't surprise folks to know that I lean towards things like educate, as a professor, so I see that really differently. Can I share my perspective? Or alternatively, appealing to their values. This is, what David was talking about earlier about sort of affirming the person while criticizing the conduct. I think of you as a really inclusive person, and therefore that comment sort of troubled me or surprised me, right? So that kind of menu of options is both in our book and, in part in this Fast Company article. So we would really encourage people to do that. But I love how tactical the question is, and it's sort of, the book tries to meet, readers at that kind of very tactical nuts and bolts kind of level.
All right, I think this is a really important question for advice on where to go or resources when you are the affected party or the party who is on the receiving end. And the person writes, so often I find myself standing up for myself as one of the few trans people at work. So how would you, what kind of advice do you have there?
I think there are some, I do think, as I mentioned before, that even though our book is not written for sort of people on the affected person's side, we hope that it does have some tools for people who find themselves in that position, because I think a lot of the strategies that we offer for confronting sources of non-inclusive behavior will be useful for people if they find themselves the target of a biased comment, and rather than just an ally. And I think it's also helpful for helping people identify experiences that they've had or behaviors that they receive from allies in their lives. So one of the tools that the uses to which we hope our book will be put is that people will read it and think, oh yeah, I've experienced that on the receiving end. And so I now have a name for that thing that I've experienced. I can put words to it. And so when I'm confronting someone in my organization or speaking up for myself with people who are sympathetic in my organization, I can now use this book as a tool to help to say, oh, I think what you just engaged in was ADDA behavior, right? Avoid, deflect, deny, or attack behavior that we were talking about earlier. And so I think that is one resource. Another wonderful book that I always recommend is Dolly Chug's book, The Person You Mean to Be. So we've spoken a little bit about Dolly. I think her book also has some excellent resources for how to drive inclusion. So yeah, I hope that's helpful.
The next question gets to the point of allyship and folks who maybe don't seem to want to be allies. So the question is, what about getting people to the point where they're even willing to be an ally and engage? I work with a lot of cis heterosexual white men who aren't even willing to get to this place.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm glad that we're getting this question, because I think it allows us to sort of clarify something that's really important, which is, all of D&I sort of follow some version of the 20-60-20 rule, right? To use Susan Annunzio's, work that Dolly Chug, also mentioned earlier, builds on, which is 20% of the people are like the people in this room who really care about D&I and have kind of immovable commitments to it. 60% of the people are in the movable middle, and then 20% are ideologically opposed. So we want people to be careful before they put someone in that stuck 20%, because people can always surprise you. But I think that what people expect us to say is to say, oh, engage with those people, draw them in, talk to them, have infinite patience and grace for them. And that's actually not our attitude. Our attitude is, once you determine that someone is in that stuck 20% and has no interest in learning and is no more movable in their commitments and we are movable in ours, then leave them alone. Like, even if you have to engage with them, understand that you're not doing it to persuade them. You're actually speaking to the movable 60%, right, who's around listening into the conversation, rather than trying to convert that individual themselves, right? So the book is pretty laser focused, right, on, the responsibilities of an ally in conversing with people who want to get better, right, at D&I, right, rather than, people who are ideologically opposed to it. And then going back to, your earlier exchange with David, I also want to say that we take a kind of principled stand in saying, yes, we're happy to direct you to other resources, but this book is really not about what affected people should do. Like, for too long, affected people have carried the burden of these conversations. And this book is really trying to enter in to say, to borrow the Yale professor Jennifer Richardson's phrase, let's democratize the discomfort. Like, for too long, affected people have been burdened by this and then been given tips and tricks and strategies to deal with, right, their discomfort. And our thought is, like, that's looking at this from the wrong lens. We don't want to coach affected people. We want to coach allies, so that the allies are stepping into the conversation, are shouldering some of the inherent discomfort of these conversations and stepping up to do their part, because oftentimes they're the more empowered people in the exchange, and they're the people who can make the transformative difference.
I love the phrase democratizing discomfort, and hopefully it's actually working towards democratizing our entire, communal life together. That we're at time right now. We are exactly at 2. So we probably need to wrap up. I apologize if there are questions we didn't get to, but I'm sure both David and Kenji would be happy to hear from folks who want to continue the conversation. Again, we're so proud and excited for you. Happy launch week. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. I know there are more events coming up. I think we've been putting links in the chat. So if you didn't get everything you wanted to hear out of this hour, there will be opportunities to continue to listen in on talks that Kenji and David are having as they kick off their Whirlwind Book Tour. But in any event, congratulations to both of you, and thank you, everybody, for being here. And it's the start of a really great conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.